Alrighty. Well, thank you again, everyone. And if you hadn't joined us at the very beginning, I want to apologize for the audio problems in the last 2 weeks, but I think we've got those squared away now, and we should have good sound on both YouTube and the bridge. And we've got streaming audio and backup audio, and streaming video and backup video. So let's move on. Let's go into the flow today. Let's go with this idea. I just want to mention at the beginning, and I just want to mention this in passing for you to consider some other time, but in the scriptures, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the primary scriptures that we use in our culture, the number 4 is a very significant number. It is a number of completeness, but it's a unique kind of completeness. You know that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, that Moses had to go into the desert for 40 years, that Jesus had to go into the desert for 40 days. Right? There's something about this number 40, number 4 and 0. And 0 means an indefinite period of time, as long as it takes. When you read the number 40, it's telling us that somebody did something for as long as it took in order to complete. And what they were completing, what the number 4 means, is physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. For as long as it takes to grow physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, typically to complete whatever the task was, whatever was assigned, whatever the change in consciousness was that was required. Right? Moses had this mission, according to the scripture. Moses had this mission to accept, to free the people from Egyptian bondage. But he wasn't mature enough to do that. His emotions were not under control. He killed the Egyptian officer, buried the body in the sand. And he had to grow into that role. So he went to the desert. And in the desert he met the 7 sisters. And that represents the 7 main aspects of God. And they were at the well. And well always means, the symbology is going into deeper consciousness. And the daughters were the son of the priest. He had to make his approach to God. And he had to stay in that desert for 40 years. He had to stay in that desert. The prayer life, the inner world is what the desert means. And he stayed there until he got it together physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Only then could he go and complete the work that he felt he was called to do. So what I'd like you to remember out of that is this concept of physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We tend to think of our life here on this planet as physical. It's physical. We eat, we sleep, we breathe, we walk, we sit, we stand. It's physical in nature. Gravity works upon our body. It's physical in nature. But that's only one aspect. That's only one aspect of the experience. And it is not what defines us. That is not what defines us. We identify with our bodies. You can see that in our culture, that we think we are our physical size, our physical shape. Somebody picks on our bodies, we get upset. But we are not our physical bodies. Our physical bodies are something that we use while we're here, something that we use to express the consciousness that we are. But they don't define us as being all that we are. And the same with our intellect, our mental cells, and the same with our psyche or emotional cells. It is only when we start to tap into the spiritual self, the spiritual, that we get a little glimpse of what we truly are, a little glimmer of what we truly are. Before that, before we grow into that, we tend to over-identify with the physical, the mental, and emotional. We at times feel victim, that we have fallen victim to the physical, the mental, the emotional. You'll hear people say, I had no other choice. I did what I had to do. There was no other way, you know. Somebody said something to me and it hurt my feelings and upset me, and I had to lash back out at them. There was nothing else I could do. And what they're saying is I'm a complete victim of my emotions. I have no control over them. You know, I can only react. I can only respond. That's part of life. We all do that. We all have done that. We all experience that. But we have to recognize that there's something greater than that. There's something greater than just the physical, the mental, the emotional. This is why the scripture tells us to turn the other cheek. It doesn't mean to necessarily let people beat me up. It means to turn to the spiritual aspect of the situation. Because that's, as we spoke last week, that's where your help comes from. That's where your help comes from. Another way that people look at the number 4 is they look at the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and the human. They look at kind of the 4 kingdoms, Thomas Troward would call them. And Troward says that it's not until we step into the 5th kingdom in his way of reckoning, the spiritual kingdom, it's not until we step into the 5th kingdom that we really start to come to tap into our potential, to tap into what we can truly be. As long as we consider ourselves to be animal, to be vegetable, to be mineral, to be physical beings, you know, to kind of live life defined and contained by our experience on this planet, we really don't outgrow that. We don't step into a bigger realm of possibility. Now, interestingly enough, if you study into Jewish mysticism, they talk about the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and the speaker. They completely bypass the human and they go to the speaker, because if we are functioning at the human level, we are not really into our self-reflection, as I talked a couple weeks ago. We are not really starting to exercise our spiritual power. And in that regard, we are functioning much as just a human animal, not denigrating animals. Animals are beautiful creatures. But we have not tapped into our spiritual power. So that's all just by way of kind of setting up what we want to do. What we want to look at is the experience that we have at the physical level, the experience that we have at the mental level, the experience that we have at the emotional level is largely one that is built of tension and release, tension and release. But there is another experience, there's a spiritual experience. And we want to contrast these first three quarters of the number 4, the physical, the mental, emotional, the spiritual. And we want to contrast the first 3 against the 4th, because the spiritual is our true nature. That is what we're growing into every day. We're growing into a deeper awareness, hopefully every day, of the spiritual nature of the universe, the spiritual nature of what we, as an expression, of the divine are. The very spiritual nature of God. What is this thing called God? By whatever name we choose to call it. So here's what I mean by this. It just, we become so accustomed to it that we expect it to be normal. We expect tension and release. It permeates every aspect of our human experience. And we tend to carry it into our spiritual experience. When we begin to awaken to our spirituality, we tend to carry this tension and this release into our spiritual experience. But there's a step beyond that we want to talk about today. So at the physical level, everything about our physical beings, everything about our bodies, we start to think about them, relies on tension and release. Tension and release. We get hungry and we eat. And the hunger is released. Tension and release. Tension and release. If we don't take a breath for a little while, you hold your breath, what happens is tension starts to build up. Something within us says you've got to breathe, you've got to take a breath. I think I remember when I was a kid studying biology, they said that as the carbon dioxide level in our blood rises, there's a trigger mechanism that tells us it's time to breathe, it's time to breathe. But there's tension, and then we breathe and release, tension and release. We get thirsty, we drink, tension and release. Our heart contracts, our heart releases. That's what makes the blood go through our bodies. Tension and release. We move, our muscles move our body through tension and through release. So it is completely normal. It is completely normal at the physical level of life. It is completely normal that we are so accustomed to this tension and release that we never even give it thought. None of us thinks about, well, is it time to breathe yet? Why am I breathing? None of us thinks about, how do I make my heart beat? How can I do this? It just does it. See, it just does it. But it does it through tension, and it does it through release. And we accept that as being normal. Now that tends to carry over into other aspects of our being, into the mental and into the emotional arenas of life. So in the mental or the intellectual area of our life, we tend to work on problem solving. Life is a series of problems that needs to be solved for many people. When you go into business, it tends to be, how are we going to get more customers? How are we going to make more sales? How are we going to expand our business? How are we going to counter the competition? And very quickly what happens is the activities become a series of react and respond activities, which are tension and release, tension and release. We have a goal to make a certain sales quota. What are we going to do? How are we going to strive? How are we going to get to that goal? We turn it into a struggle in order to get there. We have competitions. We have prizes to win. We have cruises to go on for the sales team that makes the quota. And the tension and release that is so normal at the physical level now becomes very normal at the intellectual level. It is so prevalent in our society that if you are creative, if you just want to go and paint a painting or take a picture or be in nature or meditate or do something like that, society looks and says, well, what are you wasting time with that for? Why are you doing that? What's the benefit in that? What problem are you solving by doing that? Remember a couple years ago there was a discussion on public education in the state of North Carolina, and one of the officials was saying that they really shouldn't offer degrees in humanities in publicly funded colleges because there was no value to them. See? They didn't result in good, high-paying jobs, and the taxpayer should only pay for curriculum that would lead to good, high-paying jobs. That was this politician's view of the world. See? The value in simply being, the value in the isness that I talked about in the opening treatment was just not there, just could not be seen. So what we tend to do is we tend to spend our lives in the intellectual, we set up a series of struggles. We set up to make things problems that sometimes don't even need to be problems because we actually get kind of addicted to this idea that there has to be a struggle. We have to have some goals for today. Look at your day planner, Do you have your A, your B, and your C priorities on your day planner today? You've got to work towards these things. You've got to strive towards these things. And again, when I was in business, we used to go in every month. We would go in and look at our 30, 60, 90-day objectives. How are you doing compared to what you said you were going to do? Everything was set up to be a struggle, not a flow, but a struggle. And then there's competition, and there's infighting, and there's internal politics, and there's all these other things that we take as being normal, a normal part of life. It even carries over into our arts, for example. In music, one of the ways that music works is music works by creating dissonance and cognizance. The song starts playing and our minds kind of figure out where it is. We identify the key, is what music teachers would say. We identify the key that the song is in, the bass tone of the song, the key. And then the melody starts wandering away from that. It goes up above it a little bit, it comes down below it a little bit, it goes back up above it a little bit. It almost comes to it. And then finally, it resolves back into where our minds expect it to be. And composers know this, and they deliberately create tension within the song. They deliberately create it so that in opera, when the tenor is hitting the very, very high note, and they're holding that high note, and it's just going on forever. That is almost where our mind wants it to go. And they hold that, and it's creating all of this tension, and then finally, they hit the note that our minds have been craving for them to hit. Boom, the tension gets released. In paintings, we have the contrast of light and dark and color, and where things are placed, and they can kind of create, the artist can create a tension in the picture that holds our attention. So this idea of tension and release, you can see now that it starts to permeate our existence. The physical level, it controls our bodily functions. At the intellectual level, we tend to make things a struggle and a competition, and oh my goodness, we have to win. How much time do we spend as a society talking about winning something? A football game, or the World Series, or the election, or all of these different things. These are all struggles that are set up. And who made the rules? Who makes the rules of the game? I laugh because many, many years ago, it's got to be 40 years ago, we went on a camping trip. And one of the couples we were with had a little guy there who might have been about 2. And we took him to the miniature golf course for the first time. And his dad said, the objective here is you want to get the ball in that hole down there. And then the little guy just looked up and shook his head like he completely understood that. And his father said, okay, go ahead. So He bent down where he was. He picked up the ball. He walked down to the other end of the little miniature golf hole when he dropped the ball in the cup. And he turned around. He was looking for praise. You know, he did it. He did exactly what he was told. And all the adults are laughing. No, 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 no. You have to make it harder. You have to. It has to be a struggle. You have to stand here and you have to hit it with the club and you've got to bounce it off the rail and you got to go around that little obstacle. You know. We make it more difficult than it needs to be in order to satisfy our expectation that tension and release has to be fulfilled. There has to be a struggle. If there's no struggle, what's the good in winning? You know, if there's no struggle. You hear people talk about this in culture today. Why do we give ribbons to everybody? Why only winners need to get ribbons? If everybody gets a ribbon, well, there's no struggle. There's no struggle. We have to struggle. We have to make it into something more difficult than it already is. Going back to the arts, if you think about drama, if you think about the TV shows and the novels and the things that we see, drama is all about tension and release. You know, we get introduced to a character at the beginning of the show, and within the first 5 or 10 minutes, we find out what it is, what it is that they want to do, what is it that they want to do more than anything in the world. You know, in a lot of the cop movies, it's the cop is going to retire that day. You know, Danny Glover, this is his last day on the job. Of course, Mel Gibson's his partner, and you know something's not going to be easy. But it's the last day on the job, and all he's looking for is retiring, and he wants to get that sailboat and move to the Bahamas and spend the rest of his life under a shade tree sipping drinks with little paper umbrellas in there. It's the first 10 minutes of the movie, and then of course something happens. Something happens that creates tension, that starts to move our key character, our protagonist, our hero, moves that person away from where he or she wanted to go. And as the movie goes on, another thing happens, and then another thing happens, and everything that happens pulls that character away from the one thing that they really wanted more than anything in the world. I just wanted this to be an easy last day on the job, you know. And now I've got all these bad guys shooting at me. And the tension rises. You learned this in high school in essay composition. You know, the tension rises and it rises and it rises, and finally it gets to a climax in the movie. It just can't. It just can't get any worse, you know. Well, how is he going to get out of this one? Something has to be done to give us release, you see. The screenwriter, the author, the director, whoever is making the story, they have to give us a resolution one way or the other. So either the good guy miraculously wins and figures out how to defeat all the seemingly unsolvable problems that were thrown his or her way in the course of the drama, or they die. One way or the other, they have to bring it to resolution. And it's very interesting when I started studying filmmaking is that some of the films that we make have different endings depending upon what culture they are shown in. In the United States, typically the hero, the good guy, the protagonist, somehow miraculously pulls it out of thin air at the end of the movie and prevails. But in other cultures, the hero has to lose. That's what they're used to. That's what they're used to in that culture. So they actually shoot a different ending to the movie, shoot a different ending to the story, rather than the good guy winning and everybody going home happy. And great tragedy, the good guy loses, but he put up a good struggle. He put up a good fight, because it's the struggle you see in that culture. It is the struggle that is important. So even in the TV shows that we watch, the movies that we watch, the novels that we read, this idea of tension and release, and tension and release, and tension and release prevails. So that is kind of the mindset that we have when we start to to discover our spiritual nature. And in many cases, what you can see is that human beings have taken this idea of tension and release and they have projected it onto their God. God is an angry God. See, God is something that needs to be feared, and God is a vengeful God. And all of these concepts, God has enemies. The enemies need to be punished, and we have to be those instruments of punishment. And then we have holy wars, and we have all of these kind of crazy ideas that human beings have created about God in order to justify their own addiction to tension and release. By the way, if you think of addictions, tension and release is very, very visible there. So what we want to do is we want to step away for just a moment from the human concept of tension and release and the fact that human beings project this onto God, that God must be just like we are because God created us out of itself, and therefore tension and release must be the nature of God. And what we want to do is we want to consider that these experiences of tension and release that we have become so familiar with are just something that we're designed to outgrow, something that we are designed to move through. They were perhaps necessary at a time in order to get us where we are today, but now we are arriving at our spiritual nature. We are entering the fifth kingdom, as Thomas Troward called it. We are entering our spiritual nature. We have to go in, of course, we have to go into our desert. We have to go into our consciousness, into our prayer life. We're to go into our closet, as the New Testament tells us, and to pray in secret. We have to do our spiritual practice. But at some point we start to recognize that there can be no struggle in the divine mind. God does not create out of need. In the human experience, we do something because of need, struggle, of tension and release. We need to eat, so we grow food. We need shelter, so we build houses. See, our entire experience is one of identifying a need and fulfilling that need. Anybody who went to business school, that's the first thing you were taught, right? Find a need and fill it. Find a need and fulfill it. That's what business is all about. But what does the divine need? What does God need? Nothing. It is everything. It has everything. It is omniscience. It is omnipotence. And it is everywhere present. So it cannot create out of a sense of need. That sense of tension and release cannot be there in the divine. It's just not there. There's a different way of being. There's a different way of functioning. It is the isness, the suchness, the I amness, the beingness that the mystics tell us about. Now the divine is active, but I want you to consider that there's a difference between activity and struggle. Struggle is kind of our attitude or our ideas about the activity. You know, if we think it's hard, we think it's terrible, and we think it's awful, it becomes a struggle to us, as opposed to it just simply being activity. The divine thinks. The power that responds to thought acts upon those thoughts, and the universe comes into creation. Right? There's the creation myths of the various cultures. God spoke its word. God thought. God said. All of these things, but the basic idea underlying the myths is that creation was a mental activity of the divine, a deliberate intention of the divine. The divine said, "Let there be," and there was. And this power that responded to the thought didn't struggle. We don't have in all of these different creation myths. There's no record in there that God struggled. It doesn't say God said, let there be light, and there was this big groan and moan in the universe, and there was this big cataclysmic fight, and then suddenly there was light. God said, let there be light, and there was light. There was light. This idea of the struggle between the Prince of Light and the Prince of Darkness came into human thought thousands of years later. Thousands of years later. It's a human invention that we projected upon the divine. So God is, and its creation is just a function of its being. Dr. Holmes tells us to consider that we're in a boat and we're out in the middle of the ocean. And as we have a thought, an iceberg forms in the ocean, and that iceberg is the perfect projection of our thought. If we think of a car, an iceberg forms as a car. If we think of a boat, an iceberg forms as a boat. And then we move our thoughts to something else, and that iceberg melts, and a different one takes its place. Think of that as the divine creation, as the process of divine creation. No struggle, no strife, no need, just a desire, and the desire is fulfilled. We, at the human level, we cannot comprehend that. We don't understand that. You know, I think it was Zig Ziglar. I can't remember. It might have been another author, but one of the psychology self-help books that I read back in the 70s, the author was talking about this idea that things have to be a struggle, and we get so accustomed to them that we expect them to be normal. And he said when he got drafted in boot camp, there was a young boy with him who was from Alabama. I think they were from Alabama. And he said the boy grew up on his mother's cooking, which was largely deep fried, you know, breaded fried chicken and deep fried okra, and almost every meal there was something that was deep fried. And this boy had been in the Army for about a week or so eating the bland Army food, and he went on sick call. He wasn't feeling right, so he went on sick call. And the doctor said to him, "Son, what's the matter with you?" And the boy said, "Doc," he says, "I don't know what's going on." He says, "But my fire's gone out." He was so used to having the heartburn from his mother's cooking that he couldn't quite understand what it was like to not have that. He thought something was wrong. Something was broken. And in the human experience, if we don't have this sense of tension and release, this sense of struggle, something's wrong. In fact, we'll create it where there doesn't need to be one. We will find a way to make it more difficult than it needs to be. But the divine does not have that sense of struggle. We have to really get clear on that. The divine does not have that sense of struggle and tension and release. It's more of a flow. More of a flow. The river flows to the ocean. The river doesn't struggle. I think it's in the Tao they talk about, you know, about doing, non-doing, and they talk about the perfect activity of the water, you know. It does all things, but it doesn't do anything. It moves against the rocks and shapes the rocks, but it's not deliberately struggling with the rocks. It's just flowing past them. It is just doing what rivers do. It's just doing what gravity causes it to do. So we want to kind of get to this idea that life, the life of the divine, is flowing through us, creating according to our thoughts and our beliefs, and it doesn't have to be a struggle. It can be activity, but it doesn't have to be a struggle. So here's what we do as we start to make this transition from the human into the spiritual experience. We try to take the human experience over with us, and we start to consider, well, you know, I'm a spiritual being. The universe is a spiritual universe. There's a power in the universe that responds to my thought, the power by which prayer is answered. And now what I can do is I can use this power, this mental power that I'm aware of, this power of prayer that I'm aware of, I can use it to win the struggle. I can use it to make the struggle easier. I can use it to provide relief for the tension. And we try to do that. We try to do that. We try to use our spiritual nature to make our human life better. Goldsmith talks about this. We're trying to call God down into our human experience to make our human experience better. And what we need to come to understand as we continue to grow in our spiritual natures, first thing is that that's normal. People do that. Dr. Holmes said, yeah, people are going to do that. If you teach people that there's a power of effective prayer, they're going to pray for new houses and new cars and new jobs and all of those other things. That's something that human beings go through. But Dr. Holmes also tells us that eventually we grow tired of that, and rather than being enamored with the gifts, we want to be with the giver. We want to be with the giver. Because the only way we can receive the gifts is to know more of God anyway. And as we go through this process and we know a little bit more of God every time we pray, you see, then we say, I don't want to bother. Excuse me, I don't want to bother just trying to bring more stuff into my life. I want to know God. Emma Curtis Hopkins says, where's the merit in getting sick and then being proud because you can pray yourself out of it? He said, if you knew God, you wouldn't have gotten sick in the first place. And she's just trying to direct us from, well, I have a financial crisis. I turn to my spiritual nature. This financial crisis is resolved, the tension is released, and now I go on to something else. And then I have a health crisis, and then I use the power of affirmative prayer, and then the health crisis is resolved. And then I move on to something else, and I find that, well, I lost my job, and now I've got to use the power of prayer for a new job, and all of these things. And that's what we tend to do. You see, that's what we tend to do when we first come into our spiritual nature. And what I want to invite you to consider today is there's a whole another realm beyond that. I was reading some Joel Goldsmith this week, and I love the way that he puts things. He's always trying to take us into the mystical. Stop trying to rearrange the deck chairs at the human level of experience when there's a whole other world beyond in the mystical. He says, imagine this. Imagine that you're driving down the road. You're the passenger in the front seat of a car, and you're driving down the road with a friend, and you're going across the desert. And as they're driving down the highway in the desert, they suddenly slam on the brakes and they scream. And you say, what's the matter? And they say, well, there's an ocean right in the middle of the road in front of us, and I can't go any further. We'll drive into the ocean and we'll drown. And you say, well, that's not an ocean, that's an illusion. It's an illusion called a mirage, and you can explain all the scientific terms about how, because the heat is rising off the ground, the light waves get bent, and you're actually looking at kind of a bent version of the sky, and it looks like an ocean, but it's not an ocean, it's an illusion. And they say, well, how do we fix it? What do we need to do? Do we need to build a bridge? What do we need to do? Do we need to put pontoons on the car? What do we need to do to deal with this illusion? You say, no, you don't understand. It's an illusion. It's not reality. It's not even really there. It's not worth worrying about. Just keep driving, and it'll disappear. When you get to where it looks like it is, it'll either disappear or it'll look like it's further away. It's not there. It's an illusion. Can you imagine if they were someone who is beginning their spiritual awakening and say, well, can we pray? Can we pray to God? Can we ask God to do something to fix the illusion? And we could say, yeah, we could do that. But wouldn't it be better not to be caught up in the illusion? Not to be caught up in a sense of struggle that we've got to fix the illusion? That we have to get in there and make the illusion better? What would it be like if there was no illusion to fix? And that struck me when when I read that in Goldsmith. Actually, I listened to a tape and I heard it. It struck me that what we really want to do as we step more fully onto our spiritual path is to not worry about the things that appear to be broken. Not that, I want to be clear with this, it doesn't mean that we're not experiencing the brokenness. If we're having financial difficulties, it doesn't mean that we're not experiencing financial difficulties. It means that they are not real in themselves, that they are nothing more than a projection of consciousness. If we are experiencing health challenges, it doesn't mean that we don't feel poorly. It doesn't mean that my back's not hurting. It just means, that I haven't fully tuned into the flow of perfect health. I've bottled it up somewhere, you see. I'm not letting it through me. And I am experiencing consequences. But rather than to try to change the symptoms, which are not real to the extent that they cannot promote themselves without our thought, without our agreement, that they are simply projections of consciousness. They are the mirage in the desert. They would go away when the conditions of consciousness that allow them to be there change. They will go away. See, then we stop trying to bring God down into our humanness, and we are willing to step into our spiritual nature. See, we're not our body. Someday the body will die, but we will not. We will continue on. Someday the intellect, as we know it, will stop. It will stop working. Your intellect stops every night when you lay down and go to sleep, right? You go to sleep and you slip into unconsciousness. You're not the intellect. Where's the intellect when you're asleep? You're not the intellect. You still are. You're the one sleeping. Right? Where's the intellect? It's not there, you see. Dreams occur and the intellect considers them to be reality, but they're not. Right? They're nothing more than dreams. We step into what we call the waking world, and perhaps it is just a dream at a denser level. And what we want to recognize is that at the physical, at the mental, and at the emotional level, we have become so accustomed to this idea of tension and release being normal that we have to let that go. We have to let that go if we are to truly step into our spiritual nature. And in order to do so, we have to think of life as a flow, not as a series of struggles and release, but as a flow, a continuous flow of God's goodness, a continuous flow of God's love, a continuous flow of God's peace, you know. Even when it's nighttime, you know, the sun is still shining, right? We got that. It only appears dark because we're in our own shadow. But the sun is still shining, and God's love is always giving. And what we have to do then, instead of trying to manipulate the spiritual powers of the universe to improve our human condition of tension and release, is to let go of tension and release, and give way to our spiritual condition of flow. So if we're not experiencing all the prosperity in our lives that we want to experience, we don't have to try to get God to send us more money. We can do that, and there's a time when perhaps we should, if that's right. Remember, we can't work above our consciousness. We have to work at the level that we're at. But while we are using our power of treatment to improve our finances, we should be using our power of stillness to know more of God. Because the only reason that the condition of tension and release appears in our lives was because somewhere we haven't been letting the flow of the goodness pass through us. We start the day by recognizing that we are spiritual beings. We go through the day blessing everything by recognizing that it is an expression of God's love. We refuse to get caught up in the struggle of the day when people are telling us, ain't it awful? How terrible is that? Did you see the news this morning? Oh my goodness, We keep bringing our mind back to God. Emmett Fox said, turn away from the problems and turn towards God. Many religious traditions use the image of the good shepherd. The shepherd has the crook, right? The stick that's bent at the end. And as the sheep, now, mind you, in the Middle Eastern culture that we get these symbols from, the sheep were not raised for meat. They were raised for wool, and they were like pets. And the shepherd knew their name. This would say the good shepherd knows his sheep. And that stick was for discipline. It was to train the sheep. So as they would walk along together, of course, they were safer if they stayed in a bunch. They were safer from predators. Of course, the shepherd had the stick to whack the predator over the head. If you would like to whack a bear over the head with one of those sticks, I doubt it, but they did. But if the little lamb would stray, the shepherd would just reach out with the crook and bring it back. If it fell into a crevice somewhere, the shepherd could reach in with the crook of the stick and could bring it back into the fold. And we want to think the analogy often in scriptures of the shepherd and the sheep is you and I and our thoughts. So our thoughts are wandering all over the place. And what we want to do is we want to bring them back to God. We want to bring them back to God. So if we get caught up in our humanness, if we get caught up into our human experience of struggle and strife and problems to solve and all of these things, what we do is we turn towards God and say, God doesn't know anything about this. God doesn't know anything about struggle. God only knows that it is. And it knows that it is as me. And it has already provided everything that is appropriate for its life as me to express. So I too let go of the struggle. Dr. Holmes tells us that it makes no difference how long a room has been dark. The instant the light is turned on, the darkness disappears. If you went into a room and you made it a dark room and you took tape and you taped up all of the cracks and you put heavy cloth over the windows and over the doors and you made it completely into a dark room, like a photographer's dark room. You turned down all the lights and it was just pitch dark, probably darker than you've ever experienced in this life. And then you went and turned the light on. The instant you turned that light on, the darkness would be gone. And it didn't struggle to leave. It didn't groan. It didn't fight its way out. It didn't have to punch a hole in the cloth to get out the window. It had no power to create itself. It had no power to sustain itself. It was an illusion like the mirage. And if we come to recognize that the things that the human experience tells us that we need to struggle against are simply the darkness that needs to be dispelled by letting more of God's light into our lives, then we can let go of struggle. We can simply turn within to the presence within, to the intelligence within, to the knower within, to the guidance within, to the power within, and invite it to express itself in our lives as a greater experience of love, a greater experience of life, a greater experience of truth, and a greater experience of beauty. We have to recognize that we have allowed or we have been brought up in an environment where this idea of tension and release and struggle is so normal that we expect it. And what we need to do as we grow spiritually is to release that expectation. The sunlight comes, the rain comes, the soil knows what to do with it, the plants know what to do with it. They don't struggle. Consider the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. They don't struggle. They are what they came here to be. The invitation to you and I this week is be what you came here to be. A spiritual being awakening a little bit more each and every day into the flow of the activity of God in your life. God didn't bring you here to win. God didn't bring you here to struggle. God brought you here so that you would learn that you are its expression, a very important part of creation. And you could let go and outgrow of the human ideas of tension, of struggle, of release, and step into the I am. You are God's instrument of love, and so it is.